Today we're going over the most epic deaths in human history. Number 1, Ben, we're starting this video off with a story of the greatest wingman in human history. It's a dark night in the 12th century Japan, and a Buddhist monk named Benkei is wandering the streets of Kyoto with an abundance of temples dotting the city. Monks are a common sight, but this guy is different. At 6'6", he towers over everyone around him, and he's carrying a weapon, a cross between a sword and a long spear, called a nagata. His face gives off the vibes of someone on a hunt more than someone seeking enlightenment. And it turns out he was out hunting that night for his final victim. See, Benkei was actually a warrior monk, trained and battle-hardened in combat through his encounters with samurai. He's decided that they were an arrogant class, unworthy of their status in society. The world would be a better place with less of them around. And this led him on a bloody quest to duel and defeat 1,000 samurai, collecting their blades as trophies after each victory. At this point, he had collected 999 swords and was out that night looking for his final duel while walking near Goto Tenin Shrine. Benkei hears the sound of a flute, and when looking to see who is playing it, he finds a small, thin samurai. Around the man's waist is a beautiful gilded katana, the perfect piece to finalize Benkei's sword collection. He immediately challenges this samurai to a duel. The small man puts away his flute, and surprisingly, he agrees to fight. The two men walk together to Gojo Bridge and draw their weapons full of confidence. Benkei rushes in, but despite towering over the samurai, Ben is swiftly defeated. Instead of taking his life, the samurai just turns and walks away. Ben is shocked and left in disbelief. In the following days, these unfamiliar feelings turn to anger and frustration. How could he lose to this tiny samurai? He had defeated much larger men in the past. He decides to stalk the grounds of Kiyomudera Temple, waiting for the samurai to appear, so he could take his revenge. Eventually, the samurai does show up, and Benkei immediately challenges him to another duel, a fight that Benkei loses again. Humiliated, he bows in defeat and tells this samurai that he'll abandon his life as a monk and instead follow him as one of his retainers. The samurai, who turns out to be Minamoto, no Yoshitsune of the legendary Minamoto clan, agrees. Benkei joins him on his adventures, and the two become inseparable. They go on to join Yoshitsune's half-brothers and fight in the Jin War against the powerful Taira, a clan that had killed Yoshitsune's father when he was just a baby. After 5 years of fighting, the Minamoto clan emerges victorious, and one of Yoshitsune's half-brothers, Yoritomo, becomes shogun. The end of the Jin War had an unintended consequence without a common enemy. Jealousy and suspicion soon turned the brothers against each other, and Yoshitsune and Ben find themselves on the run, being pursued by Yoritomo and his men. They eventually find protection under another clan called the Fujiwara, and the pair spend a few years in relative peace in their domain. This ultimately did not last, as with a lot of pressure and probably a lot of bribes, Yoritomo finally convinces the Fuji to turn on his brother Fuji. No Hiya, the man who was once their protector, betrays them, and on June 15th, 1189, at the Battle of Koro, MWA, Yoshitsune and Ben find themselves trapped and outnumbered 5-1 with 500 of Fujiwara's men surrounding their castle position. The forces clash, and Yoshitsune's men put up a heroic effort. Ben in particular is a demon on the battlefield, crushing enemies who are on average more than a foot shorter than him. But despite their best efforts, Yoshitsune Yoshitsune's men quickly begin to fall with just a handful of retainers remaining. Yoshitsune realizes the battle is already lost. He turns to Ben and tells him he plans to commit seppuku. Within the castle, he'll need time to prepare, and Ben understands the assignment. He walks to the bridge that serves as the only entrance to the castle and stands alone against Fuji's army. Fuji signals a charge and wave. After wave upon wave of Fujiwara warriors charged the bridge, Benkei stood resolute. Each opponent that came at him fell in a blur of steel and fury. He cut them down, one after another, without hesitation. No one could pass. According to some accounts, Benkei single-handedly defeated up to 300 soldiers on that narrow bridge. Behind him, a mountain of bodies formed, a grotesque monument to his defiance. Standing tall among the slain, Benkei became an immovable guardian. Despite orders from their commanders, none of Fujiwara's men dared to approach. To cross the bridge was to accept death. Realizing his foot soldiers were paralyzed with fear, Fujiwara's commander resorted to archers. A volley of arrows was loosed, striking Benkei's chest. But he didn't move. Another barrage followed, and another. His body bristled with arrows like a human porcupine, yet he stood firm, unmoving. A chilling silence fell across the battlefield as time dragged on. No one dared approach. Finally, Fujiwara ordered a group of soldiers to investigate. They stepped cautiously onto the bridge, weapons raised. As they crept forward, they noticed something strange. Benkei remained motionless. No shift in posture, no flinch, no breath. When they finally reached him, they realized the impossible truth. Benkei was already dead. In an act of pure loyalty, Benkei had braced his dying body against the haft of his spear so that even in death he could stand. He died on his feet, unshaken, never letting his enemies see him fall. His final act wasn't just a delay tactic, it was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Because of Benkei's legendary final stand, his master Yoshitsune was granted enough time to perform seppuku with full honor. The ritual was completed in peace, an ending worthy of a warrior. In the end, Benkei didn't just defend the bridge, he defended legacy, dignity, and the code they both lived by. What? A. Wingman. Number 2. Yi Sun Sin. By the end of the 16th century, the Korean peninsula was in an odd state. While its people enjoyed a rare moment of peace, the ruling elite was rotting from the inside. Korea, a loyal tributary of the mighty Ming dynasty, had no real foreign enemies. China largely left them alone, and Japan was still consumed by the blood-soaked chaos of the Sengoku period. With no major wars on the horizon, young Korean men flocked to become scholars and bureaucrats. Military service? That was for the uncultured. As a result, Korea's armed forces grew soft, led by commanders who had never seen real combat. The country was stable, but dangerously unprepared. In 1590, that stability shattered. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the ruthless unifier of Japan, had finally done what no one had in over a century. He brought peace to his fractured homeland. But with peace came a problem. What now? With thousands of seasoned warriors and no more civil war, Hideyoshi needed a new enemy. His eyes turned to China. To get there, though, he had to go through Korea. In 1592, hundreds of Japanese warships suddenly appeared off the coast of Busan. This was no diplomatic visit. It was an invasion. As the Japanese soldiers swarmed ashore, Korea's top admirals panicked. 2 of them, in an act of pure cowardice, scuttled their own fleets so they wouldn't have to fight. Just like that, Korea lost half its navy without a single enemy engagement. The Japanese advanced with terrifying speed, crushing Korean forces and seizing city after city. Seoul fell, then Pyongyang. Within weeks, the invaders were knocking on China's front door. Korean forces were in shambles, morale broken, leadership non-existent. The end seemed inevitable. But amid this collapse, one man stood tall, a man who would rewrite naval history with only a handful of ships and an iron will. His name, Yi Sun-sin. After a wave of his men charge Ben, he cuts them down one after another. No man can make it past him. In some stories, he's said to have single-handedly slain 300 soldiers on that bridge. Ben-K stands stoically behind a pile of deceased Fujiwara warriors, beckoning more men to cross, and despite orders to do so, none of the Fuji's men answer his call. They all know that stepping on the bridge was a death sentence. Fujiwara, realizing his men are now too afraid to attack Ben-K head-on, calls in his archers they'll take him out from a distance. Instead, the archers let loose a barrage of arrows that find their mark in Ben's chest, but nothing happens. Ben doesn't flinch. They let loose another volley of arrows, but still nothing changes. Ben's body is now a pincushion of arrows, but is still standing defiantly in their way. Time passes, and both sides stare at each other across the bridge. Nobody dares to make the first move. Finally, Fujiwara orders some of his men onto the bridge, and they reluctantly do as they're told. As they slowly approach Ben, he makes no motion to ready himself. They creep closer, and when they finally reach the massive monk, they discovered that while he was still standing, courage rose to the occasion, a man who quite possibly was the greatest admiral to ever live. His name was Yun Shin. So Yun Shin's story is pretty interesting because, unlike most heroes, he wasn't necessarily liked by the elites at the time. In fact, they kind of hated him, but for all the wrong reasons. Basically, early in his military career, he was so good at inspiring his men and leading them to victory that he made everyone around him look bad by comparison. Remember, corruption was a big problem during this time, so out of jealousy, a general falsely accuses Yi of deserting the army in battle, and the king believes it. He strips Yi of his rank, has him thrown in prison and tortured. This experience would probably make most men quit the military altogether. But he was eventually released, and he managed to climb his way back through the ranks to commanding a small fleet of ships by the start of the Japanese invasion. Now, despite the fact that Koreans were absolute trash at fighting, at the start of this war, they did have one huge advantage over the Japanese. They've been dealing with Woko pirates along the coast for years, and because of this, they had developed ships called Panoan, and later the Turtle Ship, that were specifically designed to combat Japanese naval tactics. See, the Japanese weren't used to fighting at sea, so they basically stuck to what they were good at: close-range combat. Their strategy consisted of shooting at people with their rifles and boarding other ships and engaging them with swords and spears. Their ships were more like transport vessels rather than battleships. The Pukan, on the other hand, was a floating fortress armed with cannons and was built in a way that made boardings impossible. These ships were a huge reason why Admiral Y was able to have so much of his success, and are basically the only advantage the Koreans had, and they already sank over half of them themselves. Anyways, Admiral Y was not a coward like the other two admirals, and instead of sinking his ships, He rushed his fleet of 34 ships head first towards the Japanese and began attacking them along the coast. His capabilities as a naval commander are obvious right from the start. In just a few weeks, using tactics to bait the Japanese to sail into vulnerable positions, he single-handedly sinks over 200 Japanese ships with no losses of his own. In battle after battle, he is vastly outnumbered, yet sails away victorious every single time. He is the sparkling piece of glitter embedded in the turd that is the Korean military. And by the end of the year, he had sunk 350 Japanese ships. His efforts, along with the help of Chinese reinforcements, allowed the Koreans to drive the Japanese soldiers all the way back to Busan. And by the end of the year, the war entered somewhat of a stalemate, with the Chinese and Japanese trying to negotiate a peace deal. So things are going pretty good for Ye. But remember, the two admirals who sunk their own ships at the beginning of the war, well, one of them named Wan Gan is insanely jealous of Ye's success. So jealous, he starts talking about you to the king every day, and when peace talks with China fail in Toyot. Tomi begins a second invasion of Korea in 1597. Gun and other government officials frame Admiral Y as a traitor, and the king agrees. For the second time in his career, Yi is stripped of his rank and sent back to prison, where he is brutally tortured again. He's set to be executed, but the king has a change of heart, and he instead sends Yi back to fight as a common soldier, a humiliation worse than death. With Yi out of the picture, Wongon is put in charge of the Korean fleet, and as you may have guessed by now, he was pretty terrible at his job. He drank heavily, made poor decisions, and disrespected his men. Many of Yi's commanders refused to fight under such a downgrade, and what made things even worse for Guan was that during the stalemate, the Japanese, who had watched Admiral Y wreck there over and over again, had actually learned how to fight at sea. Their new ships now had cannons, and they began to use the same strategies
Admiral Yi had used against them. This all comes to a head in the Battle of Chilchalangan's first attempt to attack the Japanese fleet with 200 ships and the best of Admiral Yi's men. Gan sails out to confront the Japanese, and he immediately falls into a trap they had learned from fighting against Yi. The entire Korean Navy is decimated, and Gan is last seen being chopped to bits by Japanese soldiers while trying to run away. The king, realizing he may have messed up, reinstates Yun Shin as Fleet Admiral, and he takes command of the pathetic remains of the once undefeated Korean Navy. He's left with just 13 ships and a few hundred demoralized men. In the following battle, outnumbered 25-1, using superior strategy, Yi manages to send 31 of the 333 Japanese ships, again without losing a single ship of his own. This victory gives Yi time to rebuild his navy, but, not going to lie, things still look pretty grim for the Koreans. But the next year, Hideyoshi Toyotomi becomes ill and dies, his last official order being to withdraw the Japanese army from Korea back to Japan. Yi sees this as the time to finally drive the Japanese out of Korea for good, and mounts a final offensive against the retreating Japanese forces at the decisive Battle of Noryang. Yi takes his position at the top of his flagship with his son and nephew and begins beating a war drum to push his allied Korean and Chinese fleet forward. Admiral Yi's ship leads the charge, and he personally takes out 10 Japanese ships. The Japanese are in full retreat, and Yi beats his drum with intensity. Victory is within his grasp. After 7 long years, Korea will finally be free of these invaders. But suddenly, he's hit in his armpit by a Japanese musket ball. He realizes the wound is fatal, and he turns to his son and nephew and says, "The war is at its height. Wear my armor and beat my war drums. Do not announce my death." His son and nephew quickly carry his body below deck, and his nephew, dressed in Yi's armor, quickly returns to the admiral's position and resumes beating the drum. Yi's men continue to fight, and the Koreans drive the Japanese out of Korea for good. Undefeated in battle, Yi dies below deck, listening to the sound of his drum, knowing that his homeland was finally free. Number 3. Ben Lai Solomon. So, we generally cover stories from more ancient times on this channel. But this story from World War II, infamously bloody casualties on the island were extremely high, and with so many soldiers having much more pressing issues than a root canal, Solomon volunteered to replace the 2nd Battalion's field surgeon, who had been wounded. By July, both the Americans and the Japanese had suffered heavy casualties, and the remaining Japanese troops on the island came to the realization that there was no path to victory. They decided on a final Bongsai charge, a mission with the sole goal of killing as many American soldiers as possible, with no plan of returning early. In the morning of July 7, 1944, the remaining 4,000 Japanese soldiers began their final attack. Solomon's field tent was positioned just 50 yards behind the front foxholes, and within minutes, his tent quickly filled with over 30 injured troops. He did his best to tend to the wounded, but the Japanese soon broke through the front lines. He looked out of his tent and spotted a Japanese soldier bayoneting a wounded American who was lying outside of the tent. Enraged, Solomon picked up the rifle of one of his patients and fired at the Japanese soldier, killing him. Suddenly, 2 more Japanese soldiers popped into Solomon's tent, and he fired on them, taking them out as well. Like zombies, 4 more enemy soldiers then crawled into the tent from the sides, and Solomon took 2 out with his rifle and another with his bayonet. He hit the 4th soldier in the stomach with the butt of his gun, and a wounded soldier he had been treating finished him off. Realizing the situation was only getting worse, Solomon instructed his medics to evacuate all of the wounded men. He would stay behind to give them cover so they could retreat. Solomon grabbed a rifle and joined the front lines when he saw 4 men manning a machine gun. Unfall to enemy fire, he rushed to the gun and manned it himself, firing burst into the charging Japanese soldiers. He continued to fight from that position until he was eventually overrun by enemy soldiers. Days later, when the Americans returned to the battlefield, Solomon's body was found slumped over the machine gun, with 98 dead Japanese soldiers piled in front of him. His body was ravaged with 76 bullet holes and many bayonet wounds, 24 of which he may have suffered before actually dying. The blood trail on the ground showed that Solomon had repositioned the machine gun multiple times while mortally wounded. Despite saving many lives that day, Solomon was denied the Medal of Honor due to a rule in the Geneva Convention that no medical officer can bear arms against an enemy. Despite multiple recommendations from generals throughout the years, he remained a footnote in history until 2002, when Solomon was finally posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor from President George W. Bush 58 years later.